When I first found the link, it looked like every other whisper on the underside of the internet. A throwaway post with a deliberately bland file name, a few bragging lines from anonymous handles, and a single onion address that led into a rabbit hole 3 hops deep. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything more than a story, another conspiracy to pick apart over coffee and then forget. I'm a skeptic by trade, a person who believes in evidence rather than theatrics. That's why I still remember the exact way the download cursor crawled across my screen, as if reluctant to finish what it had begun. The file's name was the Anunnaki Protocols.pdf. The title was crassly sensational, but what unsettled me even before I opened it was the web of warnings threaded around the link. "Do not read if you value your sleep," someone wrote. "This is not a theory, it's an archive." The download completed. My cursor hovered. I clicked. It did not open like a narrative. The first thing that greeted me was a single page, formatted like a maintenance manual for a machine that shouldn't exist. Where a preface should have explained authorship, there was a line stamped in an angular typeface. Human frame, configuration, operating. Under it, a short table of figures. Average lifespan, 72 years plus or minus 6. Fail-safe vectors, immune collapse, telomeric decay, oncogenic cascade. Activation triggers, heightened self-awareness. The words were clinical, antiseptic, and yet written with the confidence of someone who had watched a process play out 1,000,000 times. As I scrolled, the document didn't argue or hypothesize. It cataloged. There were diagrams rendered in crude, ancient-looking glyphs next to annotated DNA strands, arrows pointing at sequences labeled with dates and Sumerian terms I didn't understand. Footnotes referenced clay tablets, surgical texts, and something called the calibration protocol. It was as if someone had transcribed engineering notes from a cosmic factory and decided to release them as a manual for the finished product. Us. At first I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. The rational explanation presented itself immediately. A hoax, a pastiche of pseudo-history and modern paranoia stitched together to frighten keyboard archaeologists like me. But the more I read, the less the laugh fit. The manual described mechanisms in a specificity that defied coincidence. There were sequences of base pairs shown not as speculation, but as code blocks, then annotations describing behaviors, variable expression under stress, neurochemical thresholds for compliance, epigenetic markers that responded to ritualized stimuli. One passage likened the human nervous system to a network of switches and timers programmed to wind down in stages. The page that made my mouth go dry read like an admission and a threat all at once. Under a header titled "Notice, Do Not Attempt Decompile," it said, "Awareness correlates with acceleration. Individuals who decode their own programming create resonance that the original calibrators can detect." The manual warned, with the flat tone of a product recall, that certain procedures for seeing the code could trigger immediate physiological reaction, headaches, hemorrhage, arrhythmia. I felt ridiculous for reading the warnings aloud in my empty apartment. I felt even more ridiculous when my head started to ache. I told myself to stop. I closed the laptop, but the images of glyphs and arrows were already vibrating under my eyelids. Compulsion is a strange thing. It feels like a voice that is not your own, but understands exactly which keys will open your hand. I reopened the PDF. The next section was a list, not of theories but of protocols. There were step-by-step instructions, how to isolate a reflective surface, the precise window in the night to attempt observation, phrases transcribed into a Sumerian phonetic transcription that, the manual claimed, would provoke a visible pattern in vascular tissue. Reading it felt obscene. It felt like reading the instructions for turning a person into something else. I should have stopped there. Instead, At 3 in the morning, curiosity and an irrational dare pushed me toward the mirror in my bedroom. I didn't light candles. I hadn't expected theatrics. But the streetlight outside carved a pale strip across the floor. I held the printed pages in my hand because the document insisted on physical gestures in some passages, as if the internet might sanitize the effect. When I spoke the syllables from the manual, my voice cracked in my throat. The reflection blinked in an unnatural cadence, not quite synchronized with my own. A fine, hot pain threaded through my nasal bridge. I touched my face and felt wetness. I looked down. A thin ribbon of blood had begun to seep from my left nostril, dark and glistening against my fingers. I thought dizziness would follow, that my vision would tunnel, but it didn't. Instead, under the skin of my wrist where the veins lay, I saw a faint pattern. Lines that weren't there before, small spirals like script written with a needle. They pulsed with something like code, a rhythm that made the hairs on my arm stand up. Panic is noisy, but this was a quiet panic, the kind that sits heavy in your chest and speaks in precise sentences. You shouldn't have done that. I slammed the laptop closed and forced myself to breathe. Rational explanations raced through me like an emergency checklist. Stress response, placebo, hallucination. None of them fit neatly. The blood had stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a crusted smudge on my thumb. The faint lines beneath my skin remained, visible when I flexed my hand. I slept in fits and starts. Each time I drifted into nothingness, the images from the manual returned sharper, diagrams of mechanisms that looked alarmingly like anatomy, columns of numbers that read like expiration dates. When I did finally sleep, my dreams weren't dreams so much as memories of a life I had never lived, of stone corridors and a voice that tasted like copper, telling me, in a language both ancient and algorithmic, that I was a design. I woke with a mouth that tasted faintly metallic and a sense that something had noticed the deviation. The manual's final admonition, awareness accelerates closure, echoed in my head like a countdown. I told myself I would delete the file. I told myself I would never touch the dark web again. But in the mornings I found myself checking the folder it had been saved in, as if some small part of me wanted to make sure the instructions were still there, waiting. The manual had shifted from being a file on my hard drive to something that occupied the spaces behind my eyes. It had broken the neat line between curiosity and consequence, and for the first time I seriously believed that knowledge could be a switch, and that something, might have been standing at that switch for a very long time. I couldn't stop reading. The manual had a way of rearranging itself in my head, paragraphs looping like bad audio, and every time I tried to step away, the instructions hummed louder, as if impatient. It promised methods to see the code, and that promise settled into me like a splinter. The ritual it described was specific down to the minute. A clean mirror facing a single light source, a window left cracked for airflow, and the exact hour when the human perceptual filter supposedly thinned. It called it the clearing. I laughed at the ridiculous precision until I realized that laughter tasted like fear in my mouth. I prepared with more care than I admit now. I made coffee I didn't drink. I took a picture of the mirror with my phone so I could compare reflections afterwards. I followed the manual's odd ceremonial testing of intention. It instructed you to say your full name 3 times, then a phrase in Sumerian phonetics it translated awkwardly into Latin characters. The words were clumsy on my tongue, a mouthful of ash and geometry. The instruction repeated, "Do not flinch. Keep your eyes on the reflection and do not blink." It was 3:33 a.m. The house was a repository of muffled noises, the neighbor's refrigerator, the distant rush of a night bus, and the candlelight made small islands in the dark. I set the mirror on my lap and spoke. The syllables felt like keys turning in a lock I didn't know existed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shivered, a tiny vibration that crawled up my arms, and the reflection in the glass did something my body did not. It smiled a second after I did. The delay was so small I might have convinced myself it was a trick of light, a delayed perception. But then the subtle bloom began under the skin of my forearm. Faint lines, not superficial but layered beneath veins, like handwriting someone had sanded into bone. The patterns moved as if alive, spirals loosening and tightening, then arranging themselves into characters I could not read and somehow understood. Understanding isn't always cognitive. Sometimes it is innate, a recognition in marrow. I felt it like a pull at the base of my skull. The manual had said, "Awareness creates resonance." In that moment, the resonance felt like a radio station finding its frequency inside my flesh. My nose bled again, soft at first, then bright and urgent. I dabbed at it with a shaking hand and saw the pages of the PDF gleam in the candlelight as if the ink were wet. Panic wanted to erupt, to scream, to throw the mirror away and forget the whole thing. But another part pushed me to keep watching, to map the emergence. Compulsion has a logic of its own. If you can observe, maybe you can control. The book had convinced me observation was a test. I failed in small, deliberate ways. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside my door, measured, too light to be human. They paused, then resumed, a pacing that matched the pulse in my temples. I live alone. The sound should have been impossible. I told myself it was the building settling, a stray cat on the stairs, but my heart was a trapped animal whose rhythm banged against the cage. I shut the book and shoved it under a stack of unpaid bills, an almost childish reflex. The lines under my skin pulsed in time with the footsteps. I went to the door and peered into the hall. The bulb in the stairwell flickered twice and steadied. No one. The elevator whined and departed. Back in my apartment, the mirror showed me the same delayed smile, the same spirals, but now there was an extra movement at the corner of my reflection's eye. A tiny shift inward, like something looking past me. The manual had warned that once you see your code, the calibrators could locate you. It had felt theoretical until then. Now it felt close, as breath. I tried to be rational in ways that read like denial. I recorded the mirror on my phone, thinking the footage would exonerate me. It recorded only static and an occasional flash of pale script across the screen that the file properties labeled as garbled data. I called a friend at dawn and forced my voice to be ordinary. He heard the tremor anyway. He asked if I'd been sleeping. When I lied a little, he said, "You sound wiped." I hung up and laughed, but the laugh was thin and brittle. The manual's instructions had a secondary clause I had missed the first time through. Certain rituals widen perception only temporarily. After the window closes, the body recalibrates, not to its prior baseline, but to a new lower ceiling. That was the language used. The book was clinical even when it was menacing. That night, the apartment felt crowded with small things. The whisper of the curtains, the soft metallic tick behind the refrigerator. Each sound took on intent. I slept in fits and woke convinced the room had tilted, that the bed had been slid half an inch towards something waiting in the dark. When I checked the mirror by daylight, the spirals were fainter, like a bruise fading. But they were not gone. They throbbed under the skin when I pressed my thumb to them, and when I flexed my wrist, I could trace the pattern as if with an invisible pen. I attempted to destroy the book. I tried to delete it from my hard drive, to empty the trash, to burn the printed pages. The file refused to vanish cleanly. Copies reappeared in different folders, with tiny variations in file name, as if mocking my attempt to purge it. The printed pages blackened but did not crumble, and ash collected in neat, glyph-like shapes at the base of the bin. That should have been a clear sign to stop, a final, obvious instruction to walk away. Instead, it became a new problem to solve. Sleep is supposed to hide you. But after the clearing, I felt exposed, as if my skin had been turned translucent and every small movement inside me broadcast outward. I woke to dream sounds that were not mine, chanting syllables that congealed with city noise, a low machinery hum that sounded like counting. The manual's final warning that self-knowledge accelerates the countdown was not a metaphor anymore. It lived under my fingernails. And I began to understand, with the sick clarity of someone reading the last page of a book they wished had never been written, that some knowledge is not liberation. It is a signal, and once sent, it cannot be unsent. The second account I found wasn't mine. It arrived as a string of messages on a forum thread buried beneath the manual's link, posted by a user with the handle _archivist. Their writing had the jagged punctuation of someone typing fast, hands shaking, which is the tone posts take when the writer knows they are running out of time. They claimed they hadn't only read the Anunnaki protocols. They had tried to pry it open at the code level to see if the document itself contained a hidden payload. What they uncovered was not a file so much as a parasite. Their post included attachments, screenshots of terminal windows, hex dumps, and a handful of images showing metadata fields filled with impossible dates, entries stamped centuries before the invention of the machine used to create them. A fragment of the manual's text, when viewed as raw bytes, unfurled into glyphic patterns that the archivist said recurred in different cultures' burial rites. The post's most unnerving file was a short audio clip. At first listen, it was only static and the hiss of low-frequency noise. But when I played it on headphones, something in the back of my teeth vibrated. Buried under the hiss were syllables, not in any language I knew, and a frequency that set my molars buzzing. The archivist wrote, "It wakes things." They described how, after running their decompiler, their laptop behaved as though haunted. The webcam light blinked, though no program had requested it. The microphone switched on and recorded for minutes. The archivist swore were just silence, until they listened back and heard a whisper layered under the ambient noise, a phonetic loop of Sumerian consonants that none of them could read, but that the archivist claimed had spoken their childhood nickname. Then the family illnesses began. At first it was small things. The archivist's cat stopped eating and hid under the tub. The younger sister developed a fever that no doctor could diagnose. Then worse, the archivist's brother had what looked like a seizure, his body arching in a pattern the post described with a clinical, disbelieving calm. Eyes rolling back, lips shaping syllables in a voice that didn't match his age. The family recorded it and sent it to medical professionals. The video file corrupted when authorities tried to access it. The post included one frame, frozen, grainy, of the brother mid-convulsion, his mouth open, and behind him, in the reflection of a spoon on the table, what looked like a tall silhouette with two long limbs. The archivist wrote that he tried to remove the files, to quarantine the machine, but they found traces in other systems. Tiny copies of the glyphic fragments appearing in random documents, in the XIF data of photographs, in smart home logs as nonsensical UTF strings. He traced a pattern of propagation that resembled biological contamination more than malware. It hopped, adapted, regrew. Each attempt to excise it made variants appear. He called it a mimetic implant that wants hosts. The post ended with less structure and more panic. He said he uploaded a partial decode to a paste bin mirror to share the fragment with others who might be able to analyze it, then watch the traffic explode. People who downloaded the same fragment reported similar phenomena. Ringing in the ears, spontaneous nosebleeds, brief episodes of clairvoyant-like déjà vu, where they remembered events that had not yet happened. Within 48 hours, the archive thread had been purged by moderators, as if some invisible, automated force had decided the conversation was too dangerous to host. But the archivist had been careful. He'd taken screenshots, he'd mirrored files, and he dropped them into his post in a scattering that read like breadcrumbs. I saved everything. You always save everything when the internet becomes a funerary record. The archivist's last message scrolled on in jagged fragments. They watch through the code. If you think you can see it, they will turn a light on. They are mining the signal we make when we know. Don't let them hear you parsing it. Then he uploaded one final image, a photograph of his living room taken from an angle that captured the whole place. There were no figures in the frame, but the family's faces were wrong. Their eyes were glassy and unfocused, their mouths slack, and in the window behind them, tall shapes crowded the glass like attendants at a viewing. The archivist's caption read simply, "We thought understanding was saving us." Minutes later, the account went silent. Hours later, moderators removed the entire thread. The forum displayed a sterile note. Content removed for violation of community guidelines. The archivist's mirror links dissolved into 404s. But the screenshots I had saved remained on my drive, a brittle archive of someone's undoing. I replayed the audio clip again and again, feeling the frequency settle under my teeth like a tuning fork. Each playback left me with a tinnitus that lingered for days, the high whine that made sleep fragile. That night I dreamed in daylight, the tall figures from the photograph standing at the end of my hallway, not moving, like server racks humming in the dark. I woke with an ache behind my eyes and the unmistakable sensation of being catalogued. My reflection in the bathroom window seemed to lag half a breath behind my motion, as if some observer watched both me and my reflection and preferred the reflection's delay. The spiral lines beneath my skin, those faint, etched characters that had first appeared in the clearing, were brighter now, a soft bioluminescence that pulsed with a rhythm I couldn't name, but that I felt in my bones. I thought of the archivist's final warning. If you think you can see it, they will turn a light on. I understood the sentence not as metaphor, but as a protocol. We had become nodes in a system designed to harvest awareness, and our curiosity was the signal. I deleted the copies I could find, but digital ghosts breed in backups and caches and the corners of devices that don't always obey human commands. You can try to be tidy with dangerous knowledge, but the knowledge isn't tidy in return. When the forum thread vanished, a vacuum opened that the internet always fills. Mirrors of the manual sprouted elsewhere, passed along by people who wanted to test or profit or be the first to say they saw behind the curtain. The archivist never posted again. I checked the handles associated with him. No new activity. Accounts silent. Sometimes in the hours before dawn, I scroll through my saved screenshots and listen to the buried audio until the high-pitched frequency aligns with something in my own chest. Then I put the files away, not because hiding will help, but because there's a primitive comfort in pretending the thing is contained. Pretending for a little while that the tall figures remain only in pictures and not in the way the air itself seems to lean.